Vinny, great to be back on your show, and I'm really excited to present the results of this new study that we have done.
Bob, thank you for coming back on this show. We had you on a couple of times before, and I'm excited to hear about this thought leadership presentation you're doing.
Sure. You are well versed in the IT services industry. You've been studying it as an analyst, as somebody who's in the middle of deals, as a deal advisor, and all this. And this is the first time that my study co-authors and I, Alan Alper, who you know very well, and Manny Ball, who I think you know, this
Yes.
is the first study that we know that looked in depth at thought leadership practices in the IT services industry. Uh, I've been involved in nearly a dozen other thought leadership studies over the years, and they were either within management consulting or across several B2B sectors, but not one on the IT services sector alone. So this opened up our eyes about these thought leadership practices in this industry.
Bob, some of the listeners may not know about some of the great work you've done in the past. Mention a couple of thought leadership pieces you've done in the past.
Sure. One of the pieces I'm most proud of, because they kind of drove the research, is a study that I did with Deloitte as a client back in 2002, in which they wanted to look at companies that had changed their business model and had succeeded in the marketplace. And they came to me with a set of secondary research and financial analysis of companies that they claimed were business model innovators, and they had a definition for that. And they said, we really want to get this research into Harvard Business Review. So can you first write a report on this? I said, yes. And two, do you think we can get this into Harvard Business Review? Because I've had a lot of experience with clients in Harvard Business Review. And I said to them, I can certainly do the first part, write a research report, but getting into Harvard Business Review, I think is don't waste your money on me or don't waste your money on anybody else, because I don't think that what you have here is really novel enough. You're not really bringing any big new insights to the world. And so they said, okay, well, tell us what we would need to do that. And I said, you'd have to supplement your extensive secondary research and your financial analysis of public companies. And we have to do some in-depth case study interviews. And so what we proceeded to do was to look at a subset of their list of companies that thrived on the back of business model innovation. A subset of these companies, when you looked at them closely, one theme came through. They made a ton of money by going into markets that their competition believed to be either unprofitable to serve or marginally profitable. So companies like Paychex, which back in the early 70s focused and still today focuses on small company payroll services.
Right.
Their average customer business has less than 15 employees. And that's, of course, in contrast to ADP and other big company payroll processors. So we looked at Paychex, we looked at Walmart, which in the early days was going into poor rural areas of the country back in the 60s and somehow having a supply chain that enabled their products to be delivered at rock bottom prices. And we looked at a health insurance company in California. Well, it was called WellPoint Health Networks. They were sold to Anthem years later, and they made a ton of money in the small business and individual insured market, which is the market that most of the large health insurers would either, price price out or just not cater to because they couldn't pool the risks in companies with a few employees. WellPoint found a way to make a ton of money in that market. So we looked at them and some other companies, and we actually talked to these companies, and we learned so much more than I think Deloitte learned in its secondary research and certainly its financial analysis. We learned so much more about why these, we later called them bottom feeders, are able to make tons of money in markets that their competition thought were unprofitable or just not worth going after. So that research wound up as a cover article for Deloitte in the Harvard Business Review back
Nice.
in March of 2003. So that I look at as a pinnacle of one of my achievements, a pinnacle of my career. The other study is one I was
And Bob,
involved in. Yeah,
Your claim to fame really came from the re-engineering that
yes,
Michael Hammer and others did in the 90s, right? I
that's
get the
right.
sense we're moving into a similar phase now as people look at AI at flattening out organizations, and you're seeing companies like Palantir deliver the huge revenue per staff count and so on. So that's a great setup for what you're about to present because we're entering a very different market for IT services, right? Which has been very labor intensive. And so go ahead and
Yeah,
present your results.
sure, sure. And I would say IT services, and I'll speak generally, which means this doesn't apply, of course, to all of them, but generally speaking, and Vinny, would love you to weigh in on this. This industry has been marketing poor and thought leadership poor. For whatever reason, maybe they abdicate thought leadership to the management consulting firms. That's why they bought a lot of consulting firms, in part for their lead stream and their thought leadership, right? To be able to get into doors at high levels in companies that they perhaps haven't been getting to in the past. But we think thought leadership, now is the time for IT services firms to be all over thought leadership. So this is the study we did. Our goal was to understand just how important thought leadership was to IT services firms and their clients. So we surveyed both IT services firms, 300, about 300, and
Wow.
clients, companies that bring in IT services firms, 200 executives in those firms. So on the IT, and I'll skip around here. So on the IT services side, the average revenue of the IT services firm was 2.6 billion. Um, and on the client side, people who, and we surveyed only executives who decide, are either the decider or play a key role in the decision to bring in an IT services firm. The average revenue of those firms was 11.7 billion. So this is a kind of a big company view of thought leadership, both from the sell side, the IT service vendors, and from the buy side, the client side.
And Bob,
Yeah.
you lit off by saying IT services haven't invested much in marketing or thought leadership. Having spent 15 years at different consulting firms, I find that because they're individuals, very smart individuals, right? Very driven individuals. There's a little bit of a pride in, hey, we're good at what we do and we know better than most anybody else, right? Your statistic of 300 firms right there shows you how competitive the marketplace has become. So you need to step up. What you know or what you're good at, it's just not enough. You got to go do primary research, like you mentioned, that the Deloitte research and so on.
Yeah. In fact, one of the statistics, not in this presentation, in the study report, whose URL I will give you in a little bit. One of the statistics was the explosion in IT services firms, even just in the US over the last 15 years. And of course, we know India, a similar thing. There's just a proliferation of IT services firms. So there are many more IT services firms for big companies to choose from, which of course means it's harder for any IT services firms, especially the smaller and newer ones, to be recognized as, a safe purchase, right? The big ones, I think, are regarded as safe purchases: Accenture, IBM, Deloitte, TCS, Infosys, etc. The smaller ones, right, have to do a lot more marketing and a lot more thought leadership, we believe.
So,
So our
so Bob,
research, yeah,
the typical thing in any sector, this is not just IT services, the bigger you are, the slower you are to move, right? And we're certainly entering a phase where what worked in the past is not going to work in the future. So there is no safe company, right? You look at US automakers and you go, the Chinese are about to dominate the auto market, right? The old assumptions don't seem to apply anymore.
they really don't. When I entered the management consulting business in 1987, we never heard of Indian IT services firms, right? I mean, you know better than I do. They were not a factor in the late 80s and early 90s. They were just starting to get going, I think, in the early 90s. Didn't they?
Mid 90s, I would say, there were a few big companies like GE that really encouraged the growth of Indian IT services. But look at what's happened to India. They're focused on IT services. China has run away with contract manufacturing, which is a much bigger market than IT services. So you
Yeah.
can you cannot take anything for granted, is the point I think both of us are making.
Yeah, you can't take anything for granted, especially given how easy it is to start up a new IT services firm today, right? You don't need an office. People can work out of their homes. There are firms that are several thousand people, IT services firms, where there is no office. They may say there are offices, but they're kind of like post office addresses. People are working out of their homes. So it's very easy to stand the new firms up these days. And I would think that trend is going to continue and maybe even accelerate.
Especially with work from home becoming common, people are accepting those models a lot more.
Right. And especially if you say, well, we work at client site. Okay, great. But it still doesn't mean you need an office somewhere. Uh, so the research process consisted of these two surveys, one of 300 people who are involved in thought leadership in IT services firms, and a survey of clients, folks who are deciders on which IT services firm gets the work. And we also supplemented that with interviews with 20 other people, including you, Vinny, who have been either on the sell side or the buy side of the IT services equation. Clients, heads of thought leadership, heads of marketing to whom thought leadership may have reported, private equity firms, and others who have, pretty experienced and deep knowledge of IT services and marketing and thought leadership and how
I guess
important thought
I
leadership
don't
is.
I don't much like the term, but they're influencers of how services get bought and sold.
Yes. Yep. So the timeline is the survey was fielded this spring, and the interviews were with the 20 people were held in summer and fall. We analyzed all the quantitative and qualitative data in August and September and came out with the report earlier this month.
A lot of
And
work, Bob. Good to see that. A lot of work.
yeah, a lot of work. So there are many findings in there. And again, I have a URL for the report at the end of this presentation. But these are three of the most interesting findings. And there are other interesting findings in my estimation. So the first is that most IT services firms, and I didn't say all, I say most, don't realize just how important thought leadership is to their success. Okay, we're going to go into that in a little bit. There are exceptions. Accenture, I would tell you, does. Um, Second, developing big ideas and then, of course, marketing them because you can't just create a big idea. You have to get it out into the marketplace. But developing big ideas about how to capitalize on digital technologies, which is what the broad topic theme for IT services firms is, right? Their thought leadership topics, I would argue, should fall under this big banner of how to capitalize on digital technologies. But developing these big ideas through best practice research, which I have found to be the optimal way to develop novel ideas, it's now essential to bringing valuable and novel expertise to market. So it's not just a matter of, well, let's look at trends in our client base and figure out what things went right on these kind of projects and what didn't go right, and therefore let's write a white paper about, what clients should do to do X, Y, Z. Best practice primary research is important now if you want to be a thought leader. The third big finding is that the best IT services firms at thought leadership, and we did separate those that we felt were best and those that were worst, and everybody in the middle. The best IT services firms at thought leadership use generative AI as a secondary research tool, but not but most are not using it to write their reports. Okay, and so there's a belief in the marketplace, uh, uh, I think a misplaced belief that, well, heck, we don't need all this money to fund studies and to have internal writers or external writers. We can just have ChatGPT write our next research report on whatever topic. Well, you certainly can do that, and it will be readable copy. But the best IT services firms that thought leadership are not doing that. Okay. More likely to be a strategy of the worst IT services firms at thought leadership.
Bob, listening to you, I talked to Malcolm Frank, who was also quoted in the report a couple of days ago, and he made a great point. He says, Vinny, where are all the Rob Carters of FedEx and Max Hoppers of American Airlines gone? The CIOs were big thinkers. He says we're about to enter a phase where we may see a resurgence of that. He thinks CIOs have become vendor managers today. They'll say, I'm an Oracle shop, I'm an SAP shop, not much innovative thinking. So if he's right, and I would love to see that happen, IT services cannot just go in and pitch there, I'm an SAP partner or I'm a Snowflake partner or whatever. You gotta be aligned with the changing CIO who says, hey, I'm going to redefine my industry. How can you help me? Right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point. And we saw those kind of CIOs in the early 90s at the company that I worked for, CSE Index at the time. These CIOs and the CSE Index had a research program, much like a corporate executive board program, where clients funded the research. We had 120 clients at the peak of this program, circa 1993. But these CIOs were looking for big ideas, you know. Yeah, they ran big shops, but they were really looking to play much more instrumental roles as kind of strategic people in their business to help kind of reshape business processes and not just run the IT function more efficiently and more effectively. So what I hear you saying is maybe there's a resurgence of those CIOs today who want to become internal thought leaders in their company and who want the IT services firms that they deal with to be thought leaders as well. Great point. Okay, so now I'm going to get underneath these three things here just a little bit. The study report is long. It's like 22,000 words. So there's much more depth behind everything I'm going to say here.
I think ChatGPT would generate that much content.
It could. Right, exactly. Hey, I should have thought about that using ChatGPT. But I'm going to talk about ChatGPT in a little bit because I think and I've seen it serve a very valuable purpose in thought leadership research. But it's not the purpose that most people have in mind right now, from what I've read. Okay, so this first finding, most IT services firms don't realize how important thought leadership is now to their success. So we asked the same question about the sell side, the IT vendors, and the buy side, the big companies that decide on which IT services firm get the work. We asked the same question. We said, rank on a scale of no influence to very high influence these 9 factors in how much they affect your decision of which IT services firm to bring in. Okay? The same exact question for the IT services firms and for their clients. So the clients ranked thought leadership content third on this list of 9. And some of these other factors were the marketplace reputation and credibility of a firm. Well, that to me is like, this is the reason for good brand marketing. Having published customer case stories and testimonials from their clients, second most important. But thought leadership was rated third most important. And I'm going to note here, and I'm sure I'll get pushback from the Gartner world. The ratings of analyst firms finished down the list, as you can see here, 7th. Thought leadership
Well,
content from an IT.
having spent 5 years there and having seen how it's evolved, I'm not surprised. I used to let's not get digress into that, but I'm not surprised by that. What I am surprised by is the divergence between what buyers rank and where they come, even the first top three, where they come up in the seller point of view. It seems a very internally focused IT services executive team that you know keeps going back to, hey, look, my price and quality is more important than anything else.
Yes. So on the sell side, on the IT services vendor side, they think the quality of their prior work at a client or that they can show a new client, that's most important. That finished fourth on the buy side. Customer case studies, well, they finished second at both the buy and the sell side. But thought leadership content was next to last on this list we provided. So only 59% of the IT services firms, and remember, the people we're surveying are people involved in thought leadership. So if you think anybody would have maybe an overblown view of how important thought leadership would be the people involved in thought leadership in IT services firms. So even the people involved in thought leadership rank the content they produce as eighth most important on what clients on how clients decide to buy. Okay, and so this is a pretty striking finding. 79% of executives at clients believe thought leadership is highly influential to their selection decision, yet only 59% of IT services firms think that's how clients value thought leadership. Right?
I wonder if buyers, a lot of vendors will do win-loss analysis. It's not a very thorough discipline, but many firms do that. I wonder if buyers give them this feedback when they do the win-loss analysis. I suspect not.
Suspect not. I mean, I guess that I imagine that might be a hard conversation for the on the client side to have with a vendor, which is we didn't choose you. You were not chosen because your thought leadership content stinks, right? I imagine that kind of feedback doesn't get extended.
Having worked with several buyer executives, many of them are like being, don't even do the win-loss and don't even participate in win-loss because a lot of vendors will use that as an opportunity to represent their case, right? So it's often a waste of time from a buyer's perspective.
Yeah, yeah. So so anyway, I thought this is one of the most striking findings
It
for
is, it
Alan and
is.
Manny. You know, which I think on a positive to look at it positively for IT services vendors, to us it says there's big opportunity here, right? To get much better at thought leadership and rise in, more often than not on the short list and hopefully rise at the top of the short list. Okay, so that's the first finding here. Finding number two, the being able to develop big ideas, thought leadership, through primary research and to market that primary research well is now essential. So this slide here, this exhibit is from the buyer side, from the client side. It's what clients want most in thought leadership content that they read. It's the format they want most. Number one format was long primary research reports. Now, we fully expected the buyers the clients to say, we only like short reports, 800-word blog post summary versions. That's not what they said. They said, we like long primary research reports more than anything else. Okay. And I know there's a sentiment out there in my discussions with IT services clients and prospects where they say nobody will read anything more than 1,000 words or 500 words, right? They're not going to read a 20,000 word research report. And yet their clients, they're trying to sell to, say the opposite. So I don't know what your thoughts are on this and what your experience is here.
My primary research tends to be in my books, which is last over here. If you remove the Amazon branding and all that on books, because I write a lot of case studies in my books, they're really like long primary research reports, right?
Yeah.
And I have kind of disciplined myself to not have a book more than 300 pages because I had input from readers that said, we will read it over a long international flight or a long cross-country flight back and forth, make it consumable a lot easier, right? So I think there is a resistance to long reports, but people will read it over a long flight or, when they have a few hours, they can block away.
Yeah. If the book is good, which yours are. If the book is
Thank you.
terrible, they won't. They'll stop at page 10, right? If they even get to page 10. So okay, so keep this stat in mind here. Again, finding number two, while this capability of conducting, you know, primary research, hopefully groundbreaking findings, while that has become crucial for IT services firms, most IT services firms told us that they don't have rigorous thought leadership research processes. Okay. So they could have lied to us on this. They could have said, "Oh, we're very rigorous," but less than 20% said that. And if you add up the very rigorous and rigorous percentages, they still add up to less than 50%.
Wow.
So the majority of IT services firms and people involved in thought leadership admit they don't have rigorous processes for conducting thought leadership research. And by argue, if you don't have rigorous thought leadership research processes, you're not likely to come up with a big idea.
Absolutely. But makes me wonder, part of the problem with IT services is their marketing is driven towards generate leads, right? So it's very tactical in that sense. So any thought leadership they produce is geared at, okay, we can do this with a hyperscaler, we can do this with Oracle AI tool. It tends to be very, very, what can you generate leads for? Maybe that needs to change. And I don't know how easy it is in IT services to drive that change.
Well, I tell people that when they say, well, what should we say is the goal of thought leadership? I always say it's to drive leads and revenue. Okay. It's to increase your win rate, right? You you should be able to measure at the end of a year your ROI on your thought leadership spend. How many leads did it produce? How many of those leads turned into wins? And yes, there are other factors. How good were your salespeople, right? How good was the proposal? Things that are outside the domain of the people working in thought leadership and often outside the domain of people in working in marketing. So I know there are other factors, but thought leadership should produce leads, should produce revenue, but it's not a short-term fix. I mean, great thought leadership research is not done in a month or 2 months, right? It requires time. So people looking for quick fixes shouldn't choose thought leadership as a quick fix. It just is not built to be a quick revenue fix. Okay. So, but I think that's part of the attraction of generative AI, which is like, you type a couple sentences in, give me a report, 5,000 words on this, and in 30 minutes, if you use the deep research function of ChatGPT, you come out with
Oh,
a
Google,
substantive looking report, right?
Google Gemini has really made big strides. I'm hearing more and more about that than ChatGPT. ChatGPT is still more of a personal, a Microsoft driven, thing towards individual consumers.
Yeah,
Gemini is becoming much more of a business focused tool. So,
yeah, yeah. But what those tools have done, and others, Anthropic and others, have done is they've erased this barrier of being able to write. Any person now can write at a capable level using these tools because you let the tools do the writing for you. So this barrier of thought leadership is we don't have good people who can write at a professional level, who can write at a level that the audience can understand. That barrier has been removed. If, when you hit, you know, the button on ChatGPT
to
or
your point, LLMs, big as they are, don't have access to primary research. So they tend to regurgitate what they have been taught, right? Which tends to be consumer media driven stuff. That's where they're the strongest, right? So,
yeah. All right, I'm going to talk about that because I think things are starting to change with what is primary research and what is secondary research. I think generative AI is changing that. So
okay.
hold that thought for a second. Okay, so the big idea here was of the IT services firms, and we say leaders and followers. The leaders among IT services firms were those who said their thought leadership investments are a strong driver of revenue. Okay. So 69% of those IT services firms, of the leaders, said they had rigorous or very rigorous thought leadership research processes. Probably no surprise. On the other end of the spectrum, the followers among IT services firms, these were the firms that told us their thought leadership did not drive revenue at all. Okay, that's how we define leaders and followers. The followers, only 34, about a third of them said they had rigorous or very rigorous processes. Okay, so maybe the problem for those where their marketing was poor or whatever. But so about twice the percentage of leaders than followers have rigorous thought leadership research processes, and that was not a surprise to us. And the third finding is that generative AI is not a cure-all for becoming a thought leader. um, so again, we compared leaders and followers. We said, how are you using generative AI in thought leadership research from, this, you could look at this as a thought leadership research process. From first thing is we got to pick the topic, find out if there's a lot of competition on that topic, if there's white space or not. Second, we're going to talk to people, SMEs inside our company, outside our company. Well, we got to summarize, what they told us, producing new insights from qualitative data and quantitative data surveys, conducting secondary research, which is in my own practice is where I think generative AI is becoming is a powerful tool today. Structuring that, and in fact, we'll talk about it in a second. I'm not even sure it should be called secondary research anymore. So structuring a narrative, you get all the research findings in, you've done your analysis of the quantitative and the qualitative and your secondary research, and you say, well, what the heck are we going to say on this topic? Or we'll need an outline, all right? Starting with what's the problem again in the world that we've researched, and et cetera. Writing prose for research reports and derivative content from a research report, blog posts, white papers, conference presentations, et cetera. Editing prose, creating the visuals and graphics, creating multimedia content. So you can see the leaders, in terms of writing prose, a little less than a third of the best IT services firms that thought leadership are using generative AI to write the prose of their research reports, less than a third, whereas nearly half the worst IT services firms that thought leadership are using generative AI to write the prose for research reports. And the way I look at it is, if you're letting ChatGPT write the prose of your research report, you're in effect outsourcing your thinking to these tools. And that's an attractive thing to do on the surface because you don't have to hire researchers or writers and it takes 30 minutes or less. It's an attractive, seems to be why would you not do it? The best companies that thought leadership do it far less than the worst companies do. So let me now talk about this 47%, 40% thing, conducting and synthesizing secondary research. What I'm finding is both Google Gemini and ChatGPT, which are the two generative AI tools that I use, they can be pretty amazing at gathering the details for best practice and worst practice case studies, particularly if the companies you're asking them about, Starbucks, Amex, Paychex, or whatever, are publicly held companies, because we all know that they have to disclose a lot more to the public than the privately held companies do. So asking a generative AI tool to say, and I've done this, they say, and I did this recently, I said, I want you to compare to me two companies in the same industry, somewhat competitors, but not, in the newspaper industry, the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times. LA Times was a public company at one time. Tell me why one company's digital strategy has been highly successful, New York Times, and the other's company's digital strategy has been unsuccessful, LA Times. And I said, give me everything, find everything that, focus on what their executives have said publicly, not what analysts have said, what their executives have said publicly, and tell me why one company strategy has been far more successful, digital strategy, online edition, than the others. What came back to me after, I think, at least 30 minutes on ChatGPT was astounding. Not just the facts that would have taken a desk researcher weeks to gather, but the analysis of the facts. Now, of course, you can't just cut and paste this stuff. You've got to check the facts because some of these facts, are going to be hallucinations. They're going to be wrong. Some of the analysis may be wrong. Okay, analysis drawn on facts that the tool made up. But still, as a desk research tool, a secondary research tool, an amazing capability to gather data that would have taken hours of a desk researcher to do. So here's where I kind of tee up this, and I'd love your views on this, Vinny. When you're gathering such facts that are drawn directly from the mouths of these executives, right? Is that secondary and from conversations they've had with in that have been recorded on YouTube? They were given a conference presentation or an investor presentation, okay, and they have the generative AI has the transcripts. When you're collecting data that is straight from the horse's mouth, even though you didn't ask the questions of these people, is that secondary research still, or is that primary research?
What I find is a lot of my case studies tend to be global. A lot of them tend to be very, very internally operational focused. And I find these tools very good at what, like you say, publicly available data. A lot of the New York Times, Fortune, et cetera, stuff that is in the public domain, you've got to pay for it, but it's in the public domain, right? They're very good at mining all that data. When you need to get into operational details in a lot of companies, certainly around the world, they're very weak. Okay. So you're right about synthesizing up to a point, you know, secondary, whatever you want to call it, primary or secondary data. But if you were looking for nuance, and case studies are about nuances, right? I would not, I still am not ready to accept them as changing my old-fashioned way of looking at case studies.
Yeah, yeah. And I was skeptical too. And I'm not saying that this is a replacement for actually interviewing executives in a company to
Yeah.
understand how they did some initiative and why it succeeded or wasn't so successful, right? There's no replacement for talking to people directly and asking them questions that others haven't asked them. I mean, that often leads to insights that nobody else has come up with, right?
That I have to go through to get executives to talk to me, give them transcripts, give them several chances to review before they get published. No journalist is going to give them that, right? So it's still maybe it's old fashioned, but there's certain things will not change. You know, these LLMs will never get that level of nuance.
Maybe, but this is where I might debate you a little bit, and we may not have time for the debate. But but one of the things I made sure I did in the prompts that I wrote into ChatGPT and Google Gemini was I want to hear things directly said by these executives in these companies, in these case studies. I don't want to have it through what a Fortune magazine writer, his or her
Okay.
interpretation.
Okay.
I want to hear it directly from the horse's mouth, right? From
Okay.
these companies and disregard everything else that they could certainly gather. They could certainly gather tons of articles. I want to hear directly what the executives in these companies have said publicly. And unlike 30 years ago, when I had to go to the company library or a library outside of Boston to do any serious business research, just to do secondary research of, well, what did journalists say? Or what did Harvard Business School? Is there a case study on this company? Unlike 30 years ago, what I would argue is companies have been, especially public companies, have been, as I call it, spilling their guts online. Okay. For example, quarterly earnings calls, okay, and the transcripts. They weren't available 30 years ago, right? So companies speaking at conferences and the recordings of were permitted of these speeches couldn't do that 30 years ago. Okay. What Reed Hastings has said about the key success factors of Netflix 30 years ago, unless you went to that conference, you can't tap what he said. Very easy today. Very easy today. And so companies have been spilling their guts online. Generative AI, I think, from a thought leadership research, case study research standpoint, is a great collector of all this explosion of what companies are saying about certain initiatives that they're doing, certain practices, just an explosion of this online. And so I see generative
But
AI.
Bob, the people you interviewed probably are not as adept at prompts as you are of these tools, right? So we're digressing again, but
Yes,
you've done this for 30, 40 years, right?
yes.
So you know what exactly you're looking for. So that's a huge
Yeah,
advantage.
it might be, and I haven't seen it that way, but I'm pretty good at writing clearly, right? And so you have to have that ability to get something useful out of
Yep.
generative AI tools. And so anyway, so I'm just putting this question up here. When you do your
Just,
research that way, is that secondary research anymore?
I think it's a academic discussion.
Yep,
I mean, so long as it's provocative and different, I think call it what you want.
yep, yep. Okay. And certainly it would make us all better prepared if and when we get the interview at a company that we think is best practice, right? We're much more prepared if we do the kind of things that I've mentioned here to kind of get, we would hope, closer to the questions that we should ask that would reveal some insights that we are pursuing. Okay, so the big lesson here is generative AI, if you're just using it to write your research reports, probably not a good idea. If you're using it to find best and worst practice case examples and you write the right prompts in there, much better use. Okay. To use it maybe to edit, you're not a professional writer, let's say, somebody who's not a professional writer, to edit, go ahead. But also realize that when you do that, you're putting your research report into
Public domain.
something that, yeah, right. I mean, all of a sudden you said, well, we're going to come out with this research report in 2 months. And you said, okay, ChatGPT, 2 months later, we'll take this to market. But could you edit this? Well, guess what? Your research report's out in the public domain, right? Even if you
Great
haven't
point.
published it. All right.
Great
So,
point.
um, all right. So what's to come? We're going to do a webinar with you early in 2026, and on this topic of why thought leadership will become even more critical to the success of IT services firms over the rest of this decade. And there, I would love to pick your brain about, well, how do you alert the CEOs of these IT services firms and the CFOs who have their fingers on the budget, right? How do you alert them that they really need to bring in, have a capable thought leadership function staffed by competent people with a budget that is sufficient to do some beneficial things? How do you change the way top management of these firms views thought leadership?
Think about the market is changing dramatically, right? 300 firms, only 300 firms that you looked at is already too many. It's a crowded market. Second, we're going through this a lot of pressure on, we used to talk about asset light companies. Increasingly, people are looking for labor light companies, right? So these firms are going to be under a lot of pressure to be different. So we'll certainly cover all those.
That sounds good. All right. So last here is where to, the URL for the website is right there. Anybody has questions about the report, I would say read the report first. It's long, and hopefully a good read. and but they should feel free to reach out to me.
Bob, this is, like I said, a lot of work, a lot of work. Thank you for doing it. And, the IT services market, there's folks who cover it and they'll write, like I did it at Gartner in certain sectors and so on. Um, but, I don't think I've seen a thought leadership study in this market forever, or at least for a long time.
Yeah, and so we're hoping that, say, by 2030, if you and I are talking, Vinny, that we're going to see a lot of best practice in thought leadership in IT services, that maybe the IT services industry is the best at using thought leadership to drive business, to drive service innovation, particularly, something we haven't talked about, because I think thought leadership has to feed service innovation. And that's a loop that even the management consulting firms have not mastered.
I mean, and if the new wave of CIOs emerges, which is much more strategic, I think this is going to become hugely important.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, Vinny,
Thank you,
thank you.
Bob.
Thank you for inviting me on your show.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And we'll continue the conversation in early 26, 26. Happy holidays.
Happy holidays to you.